A long time ago, in a vast and ancient kingdom, there was a great monastery nestled between towering mountains and endless forests. It was a place of wisdom, where monks dedicated their lives to understanding the nature of existence. People from all over traveled great distances to seek guidance from the enlightened master who resided there. Among the many disciples, there was one who stood out, not because of his devotion, but because of his ceaseless arrogance. He was intelligent, well-spoken, and quick-witted, but his pride overshadowed his wisdom. He believed that he was superior to the others, that his understanding surpassed even that of the teacher. Though he studied diligently and meditated with discipline, his heart remained restless. One day, after listening to a teaching on humility, he approached the master. "Master," he said, his voice calm but edged with pride, "I have studied all the sacred texts. I have debated with scholars, and I have practiced meditation without distraction, but I find myself unsatisfied. I feel as though I have reached the limits of what can be learned here." The master, an old man with eyes that carried the depth of the universe, looked at him with a gentle smile. "Is that so?" he asked. The disciple nodded. "Yes, master. I believe I have absorbed all that you have to teach. I am ready for something greater." The master remained silent for a long moment, as if weighing the words carefully. Then he rose from his seat and gestured for the disciple to follow. They walked through the monastery grounds in silence, past the meditating monks, past the stone courtyards, past the gardens where the wind carried the scent of blooming flowers. Soon they arrived at a small hut at the edge of a steep cliff, overlooking a deep valley. The master stepped inside and returned with a simple cup. "If you have learned everything," he said, holding the cup in his hands, "then let us see if you are truly ready." He took a nearby jug of tea and began pouring it into the disciple's cup. The liquid rose, nearing the brim, but the master did not stop. The tea spilled over the edges, running down the sides, splashing onto the disciple's hands. "Master!" the disciple exclaimed, stepping back. "The cup is full. It cannot hold any more." The master stopped pouring and looked into the disciple's eyes. "And so is your mind," he said. "So long as you believe you are full, there will be no room for anything new." The disciple's breath caught in his throat. The master placed the empty jug on the table. "If you wish to grow," he continued, "you must first empty your cup." The disciple lowered his gaze, shame creeping into his chest. He had thought himself wise, yet in his arrogance he had become blind to the truth. He had filled himself with knowledge, but he had left no space for understanding. The master turned and began walking away. "Return when you are empty," he said. For the first time in his life, the disciple was speechless. That night, he sat alone in his chamber, staring at the flickering candle before him. His mind replayed the moment over and over. How had he not seen it before? His pride had clouded his vision. His certainty had blocked his growth. Days passed. He no longer sought debates. He no longer spoke of his knowledge. Instead, he watched. He listened. He began to notice things he had overlooked. The way the wind rustled the leaves, the way the monks carried themselves with quiet humility, the way wisdom was not found in words, but in presence. One evening, as the sky melted into deep shades of red and gold, he approached the master once more. "I am ready," he said, bowing deeply. The master studied him for a long moment. "Are you certain?" The disciple nodded. "Yes, master. I see now that I was never truly listening. I was too busy proving what I thought I already knew." The master smiled. "Then let us begin again." And so the disciple started anew, not as a scholar, not as a man full of knowledge, but as an empty cup, ready to be filled. The monastery stood at the edge of a vast mountain range where the wind carried whispers of forgotten wisdom and the sky stretched endlessly above. In its halls, Monks dedicated their lives to the pursuit of truth, their days filled with meditation and quiet contemplation. Among them was a disciple known for his sharp mind and restless spirit. He had come to the monastery seeking answers, but no matter how many scriptures he read or how deeply he meditated, something within him remained unsettled. One day, he approached the master, his heart weighed down by unspoken questions. "Master," he said, "I have studied all the teachings. I have meditated for hours, yet still, I feel as though I am grasping at something I cannot reach. What more must I do to attain true wisdom?" The master listened, his expression calm as the morning sea. Then, without a word, he stood and began walking. The disciple hesitated, but quickly followed. They walked in silence, past the temple grounds, through the winding stone paths, until they reached the edge of a still pond. The master knelt by the water's edge, cupped his hands, and lifted a small pool of water to his lips. He drank, then let the remaining drops fall back into the pond. "Tell me," the master said, "if I wished to hold all the water in this pond within my hands, what would happen?" The disciple frowned, unsure where the lesson was leading. "Master, that would be impossible. The more you try to hold, the more it slips through your fingers." The master nodded. "And yet, this is what you are trying to do with wisdom." The disciple's breath caught. "You grasp at knowledge," the master continued, "trying to contain it, trying to possess it. But wisdom is not something to be held, it is something to be experienced." The disciple lowered his gaze, his mind racing with realization. He had been filling himself with teachings, with lessons, with knowledge, believing that accumulation would lead to understanding. But like the water in the master's hands, wisdom was never meant to be contained. It was meant to flow. The master rose and gestured toward the pond. "Be like the water. Do not try to hold it. Let it move through you." That night, the disciple sat in meditation, but his mind did not wander to concepts or doctrines. Instead, he simply observed. The flicker of the candle before him, the rise and fall of his breath, the way each moment unfolded effortlessly. And in that stillness, something within him shifted. Days passed, and the disciple no longer sought to grasp wisdom. Instead, he allowed himself to be present with it. He found lessons in the rhythm of the wind, in the silence between words, in the quiet understanding of his fellow monks. And slowly, the restlessness that had once consumed him began to fade. But wisdom is not meant to be kept. It is meant to be tested. One morning, as the sun cast golden light over the monastery, a traveler arrived at the gates. His robes were torn, his face lined with exhaustion. He had the air of a man who had spent his life in search of something he could not name. "I have journeyed far," the traveler said, his voice heavy with longing. "I have sought knowledge in every corner of the world, but still I am lost. Tell me, where can I find peace?" The master looked at him with eyes full of knowing. "Come," he said. "Sit." The traveler obeyed, lowering himself onto the stone steps. The master said nothing more. The traveler waited, expecting teachings, expecting guidance. But the silence stretched between them like an unspoken truth. Minutes passed, then hours. Finally, the traveler could bear it no longer. "Why do you not speak?" he demanded. "I came here for answers, yet you remain silent." The master smiled. "And in my silence, what have you found?" The traveler faltered, his frustration giving way to uncertainty. "Nothing," he admitted. The master nodded. "Then that is your answer." The traveler frowned. "I do not understand." "That," the master said, "is because you are still searching. You expect wisdom to be given to you, like a possession. But true understanding does not come from words. It comes from the space between them." The traveler sat still, his mind stirring with a realization he could not yet fully grasp. The disciple, who had once struggled with the same longing, watched the exchange in quiet recognition. He saw himself in the traveler, saw the same thirst, the same restless seeking. And he understood now what the master had tried to teach him. Wisdom was not something to be found, it was something to be uncovered. That evening, as the traveler sat beneath the temple's great tree, watching the last light fade from the sky, he felt something he had never felt before. Stillness. Not the stillness of an unmoving body, not the stillness of forced silence, but the stillness of a mind no longer grasping. For the first time in his life, he stopped searching, and in that moment, the peace he had spent his life chasing was already there. The monastery was wrapped in twilight, the last rays of sunlight retreating behind the distant hills. The air was cool, carrying with it the faint scent of blooming jasmine. The traveler sat beneath the great tree, unmoving, lost in thought. He had come seeking answers, but instead he had found silence. Not the kind that was empty, but the kind that weighed heavy, pressing against his restless mind. The disciple, who had once been like him, watched from a distance. He knew the struggle well. He had once sought wisdom in words, believing that knowledge could be possessed like gold, collected and stored for future use. But now he saw the truth. Wisdom was not something that could be kept. It was something to be lived. The traveler sighed, rubbing his face with tired hands. "I do not understand," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "I have spent my life searching. I have read the sacred texts, learned from scholars, traveled to distant lands, and yet I feel no closer to peace." The disciple approached and sat beside him, silent for a moment before speaking. "Have you ever tried to catch the wind?" The traveler glanced at him, confusion flickering in his eyes. "What?" "The wind," the disciple said. "Have you ever tried to capture it? To hold it in your hands?" The traveler shook his head. "That would be impossible." The disciple nodded. "And yet, this is what you are trying to do with peace." The traveler stared at him, the words settling into the spaces of his mind, stirring something deep within. The disciple continued, "You seek peace as if it is something outside of yourself, something to be attained, to be conquered like a distant land. But peace is not a place you arrive at. It is not a prize to be won. It is already here. It has always been here." The traveler's brow furrowed. "Then why can I not feel it?" The disciple smiled faintly. "Because you are looking for it in the wrong place." The traveler exhaled, frustration still lingering in his chest. "Then where should I look?" The disciple reached down and picked up a handful of sand. "If I squeeze my hand tight," he said, clenching his fist, "what happens?" "The sand slips through your fingers," the traveler answered. The disciple nodded and then slowly opened his hand. The grains of sand rested gently in his palm. "But when I stop holding on, it stays." The traveler watched in silence. The disciple met his gaze. "Peace is like this. The harder you chase it, the more it slips away. But when you stop grasping, when you stop searching, only then does it come." The traveler lowered his head, the weight of those words pressing into him. He had spent years on this journey, believing that peace was something he had to find. But now, for the first time, he wondered if it had been with him all along. That night he did not ask any more questions. He simply sat. The moon rose high, bathing the monastery in silver light. The world was quiet, save for the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, the traveler did not resist the silence. He allowed it to be. And in that allowing, something shifted. The days passed, and the traveler remained at the monastery. He no longer demanded answers, no longer sought to understand everything with his mind alone. Instead, he observed. He watched the monks as they moved through their daily rituals, their every action imbued with presence. He noticed the way they walked, not with urgency, but with ease. He listened to their laughter, not loud or boastful, but light, like the wind through the trees. And slowly, he began to feel something stir within him. One morning, as he sat by the river that ran through the valley, the master approached and sat beside him. "What do you see?" the master asked. The traveler watched the water flowing over the smooth stones. "The river," he said. "It never stops moving." The master nodded. "And yet, does it struggle?" The traveler frowned. "Number it simply flows." The master picked up a small twig and placed it in the river. The current carried it away effortlessly, weaving between rocks and bends, never resisting, never hesitating. "The river does not fight the obstacles in its path," the master said. "It does not stop to argue with the stones. It moves with them, around them, past them, and so it remains free." The traveler watched in silence. The master turned to him. "Tell me, how have you lived your life?" The traveler inhaled deeply, like a man trying to push against the current. The master smiled. "And what has that brought you?" The traveler let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped within him for years. "Exhaustion," he admitted. The master nodded. "Then perhaps it is time to stop fighting." The traveler looked at the river once more, at the way it moved with such ease, such acceptance. He had spent so long resisting, so long trying to force life to conform to his desires. But the river did not resist. It simply was. The traveler closed his eyes, allowing the lesson to settle deep within him. The days continued, and the changes within the traveler were subtle, yet undeniable. He no longer walked with tension in his shoulders. He no longer filled the air with endless questions. He no longer sought to control that which was beyond his grasp. One evening, as the sun dipped below the mountains, casting long shadows over the monastery, he sat with the disciple who had first spoken to him. They watched the sky darken, the stars emerging one by one. "I see it now," the traveler said softly. The disciple glanced at him. "See what?" "The peace I was looking for," the traveler murmured. The traveler sighed, rubbing his face with tired hands. "I do not understand," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "I have spent my life searching. I have read the sacred texts, learned from scholars, traveled to distant lands, and yet I feel no closer to peace." The disciple approached and sat beside him, silent for a moment before speaking. "Have you ever tried to catch the wind?" The traveler glanced at him, confusion flickering in his eyes. "What?" "The wind," the disciple said. "Have you ever tried to capture it? To hold it in your hands?" The traveler shook his head. "That would be impossible." The disciple nodded. "And yet, this is what you are trying to do with peace." The traveler stared at him, the words settling into the spaces of his mind, stirring something deep within. The disciple continued, "You seek peace as if it is something outside of yourself, something to be attained, to be conquered like a distant land. But peace is not a place you arrive at. It is not a prize to be won. It is already here. It has always been here." The traveler's brow furrowed. "Then why can I not feel it?" The disciple smiled faintly. "Because you are looking for it in the wrong place." The traveler exhaled, frustration still lingering in his chest. "Then where should I look?" The disciple reached down and picked up a handful of sand. "If I squeeze my hand tight," he said, clenching his fist, "what happens?" "The sand slips through your fingers," the traveler answered. The disciple nodded and then slowly opened his hand. The grains of sand rested gently in his palm. "But when I stop holding on, it stays." The traveler watched in silence. The disciple met his gaze. Peace is like this. The harder you chase it, the more it slips away. But when you stop grasping, when you stop searching, only then does it come. The traveler lowered his head, the weight of those words pressing into him. He had spent years on this journey, believing that peace was something he had to find. But now, for the first time, he wondered if it had been with him all along. That night he did not ask any more questions. He simply sat. The moon rose high, bathing the monastery in silver light. The world was quiet, save for the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, the traveler did not resist the silence. He allowed it to be. And in that allowing, something shifted. The days passed, and the traveler remained at the monastery. He no longer demanded answers, no longer sought to understand everything with his mind alone. Instead, he observed. He watched the monks as they moved through their daily rituals, their every action imbued with presence. He noticed the way they walked, not with urgency, but with ease. He listened to their laughter, not loud or boastful, but light, like the wind through the trees. And slowly, he began to feel something stir within him. One morning, as he sat by the river that ran through the valley, the master approached and sat beside him. "What do you see?" the master asked. The traveler watched the water flowing over the smooth stones. "The river," he said. "It never stops moving." The master nodded. "And yet, does it struggle?" The traveler frowned. "Number it simply flows." The master picked up a small twig and placed it in the river. The current carried it away effortlessly, weaving between rocks and bends, never resisting, never hesitating. "The river does not fight the obstacles in its path," the master said. "It does not stop to argue with the stones. It moves with them, around them, past them, and so it remains free." The traveler watched in silence. The master turned to him. "Tell me, how have you lived your life?" The traveler inhaled deeply, like a man trying to push against the current. The master smiled. "And what has that brought you?" The traveler let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped within him for years. "Exhaustion," he admitted. The master nodded. "Then perhaps it is time to stop fighting." The traveler looked at the river once more, at the way it moved with such ease, such acceptance. He had spent so long resisting, so long trying to force life to conform to his desires. But the river did not resist. It simply was. The traveler closed his eyes, allowing the lesson to settle deep within him. The days continued, and the changes within the traveler were subtle, yet undeniable. He no longer walked with tension in his shoulders. He no longer filled the air with endless questions. He no longer sought to control that which was beyond his grasp. One evening, as the sun dipped below the mountains, casting long shadows over the monastery, he sat with the disciple who had first spoken to him. They watched the sky darken, the stars emerging one by one. "I see it now," the traveler said softly. The disciple glanced at him. "See what?" "The peace I was looking for," the traveler murmured. "It was never something to be found. It was something to be uncovered." The disciple smiled. "Yes." The traveler exhaled slowly. "But tell me, will I lose it again? When I leave this place, when I return to the world, will the noise return?" The disciple's expression remained calm. "Perhaps, but that does not mean peace is lost. The river does not cease to exist because the wind disturbs its surface. Beneath the ripples, it still flows." The traveler listened, the weight of those words settling in his heart. "I understand," he said, and for the first time, he truly did. That night the monastery was quiet, but within the traveler, silence no longer felt like an emptiness. It felt like home. The morning sun painted the monastery in gold, casting long shadows as the monks began their daily rituals. The traveler, who had once arrived burdened with endless questions, now moved through the temple grounds with a newfound stillness. He did not rush, nor did he search. He simply walked, breathing in the crisp air, listening to the distant chime of bells carried by the wind. For the first time in his life, he was not trying to reach anywhere. He was simply here. Yet, despite his newfound understanding, a question still lingered in his heart. One day, as he sat in quiet contemplation near the great tree, he turned to the disciple who had guided him. "I have learned to let go," he said, "to stop fighting against life. And yet I still wonder, how do I carry this peace with me when I leave? How do I remain still when the world is filled with noise?" The disciple smiled, as if he had been waiting for this question. "Come with me," he said. The traveler followed him through the monastery, past the meditation halls, past the stone paths worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, until they reached a vast open field at the edge of the valley. The wind moved freely here, rustling through the tall grass, bending it with its invisible hands. The disciple stopped and gestured toward the field. "Watch the grass," he said. The traveler did as he was told. He watched the blades sway and bend with the wind, never resisting, never breaking. The gusts came and went, yet the grass did not cling to stillness, nor did it fight against movement. It simply swayed. The disciple turned to him. "Do you see?" The traveler's brow furrowed. "See what?" "The way the grass moves," the disciple said. "It does not resist the wind, yet it does not become the wind either. It allows itself to move when the wind moves, but when the wind is gone, it returns to stillness." The traveler watched the grass, understanding dawning upon him. "You mean to say that peace is not something I must hold on to," he murmured. "It is something I must return to." The disciple nodded. "Yes, the world will always bring noise. It will shake you, pull you, disturb the stillness you find here. But just like the grass, you do not need to resist, and you do not need to be swept away. You only need to remember how to return to yourself." The traveler let out a slow breath, watching the wind dance through the field. He had spent so much time fearing that he would lose the peace he had found, believing it to be fragile, something that could be taken from him. But now he saw the truth. Peace was not something that could be lost. It was something he could always return to. That evening, as he sat beneath the stars, he felt something he had never felt before. Not just stillness, but trust. A trust that no matter where life took him, no matter what storms came his way, the silence he had found within himself would always be there, waiting for him. Days passed, and the traveler continued to observe the monks in their daily practice. He noticed something he had never paid attention to before, the way they performed even the smallest tasks with full presence. Whether they were sweeping the stone paths, preparing tea, or simply walking, they did so without rush, without distraction. One afternoon, as he watched a monk carefully pouring tea, he asked, "Why do you move so slowly? Why do you take such care in something as simple as pouring a cup of tea?" The monk smiled. "Because this is the only cup of tea that exists." The traveler frowned. "But you have poured tea many times before." The monk nodded. "Yes. And yet this cup has never been poured before. This moment has never happened before. If I rush, if I let my mind wander, I miss it. And when I miss this moment, I miss life itself." The traveler was silent. The monk placed the cup before him. "Drink," he said. The traveler lifted the cup, feeling the warmth in his hands. He took a sip, tasting the tea fully, noticing the way the liquid moved across his tongue, the way it filled his body with warmth. For the first time, he realized he had never truly tasted tea before. He had drunk it many times, but never like this, never with full awareness. He placed the cup down, looking at the monk with quiet awe. So even in the smallest moments, there is something to be seen. The monk nodded. Yes, wisdom is not in grand teachings or distant truths. It is in the way you take each step, the way you lift each cup, the way you breathe. The traveler closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. He had spent years searching for wisdom, believing it to be something beyond him, something he had to travel great distances to find. But now he understood. Wisdom was not in the journey, it was in the moment. That evening, as he walked through the monastery gardens, he felt lighter than he had in years. The burden of seeking had left him. The need to grasp had faded. For the first time, he was simply living. But life always finds a way to test what we have learned. One morning, as the traveler stood at the edge of the temple grounds, gazing at the valley below, he heard raised voices behind him. Turning, he saw two monks locked in a heated argument. Their faces were tense, their voices sharp. "You were careless," one monk snapped. "You were not paying attention, and now the offering bowl is broken." The other monk crossed his arms. "It was an accident, and yet you speak to me as if I did it on purpose." The argument continued, neither monk willing to let go, each one feeding the fire of his own anger. The traveler watched, a quiet knowing settling within him. He stepped forward, placing himself between them, but he did not speak right away. Instead, he knelt down and picked up a small stone from the ground. Both monks fell silent, watching him. The traveler held the stone in his palm. "Imagine this stone is your anger," he said. "You can hold onto it, clutch it tightly, keep it with you, or..." He opened his hand, letting the stone fall to the earth. "You can let it go." The monks stared at the fallen stone, their expressions softening. The traveler met their eyes. "Tell me, was it worth carrying?" A long silence followed. Then the first monk sighed. "No," he admitted. The second monk looked away, exhaling deeply. "No." The traveler smiled. "Then leave it." The monks bowed their heads in quiet gratitude before walking away, their anger forgotten. The traveler watched them go, understanding now what the master had meant when he said that wisdom is not found in words, but in presence. That evening, as he sat with the master beneath the great tree, he said, "I think I have finally stopped searching." The master smiled. "Have you?" The traveler nodded. "I see now that peace was never something I had to find. It was always here, waiting for me to stop running from it." The master's gaze was steady. "And do you believe you will always feel this peace?" The traveler hesitated, then smiled. "Number, but I know now that even if I lose it, I can always return." The master nodded. "Then you are ready." The traveler exhaled, feeling the truth of those words settle deep within him. For the first time in his life, he did not wonder what came next. He simply was, and that was enough. The monastery stood bathed in the soft light of dawn, the mist curling through the valleys below. The traveler, once burdened by restless seeking, now walked with a quiet steadiness. He no longer chased wisdom in distant places. He no longer searched for answers in the words of others. Instead, he had learned to listen, to the silence, to the moments between breaths, to the presence of life itself. But life has a way of testing even the deepest understanding. One morning, as he stood by the temple gates, watching the sun rise over the mountains, a commotion broke the peace of the monastery. A group of villagers had arrived, their faces tense with urgency. They spoke in hurried whispers, their voices tinged with fear. The master approached them, his expression calm. "What troubles you?" One of the villagers, an elderly man with worry etched into his features, stepped forward. "Master, we seek your guidance. A dispute has broken out in our village. Two families have come to bitter conflict, and the peace we once knew is slipping away. We fear violence will follow." The master listened, then turned to the traveler. "Go with them," he said. "See what can be done." The traveler bowed. He did not hesitate, did not question why he was chosen. He simply followed. The journey to the village was quiet, the tension heavy in the air. When they arrived, they found the town square filled with angry voices. Two men stood facing each other, their hands clenched into fists, their bodies rigid with rage. Around them, their families stood divided, each taking sides, feeding the flames of conflict. "You stole from me," one man accused. "I took nothing," the other shot back. "You are a liar." The traveler observed in silence. He saw the way their anger had consumed them, how their voices no longer carried reason. He did not rush to intervene. He simply stood among them, waiting. The villagers turned to him, expecting him to speak, to offer wisdom, to solve their problem with words. But he remained silent. Slowly, the arguing men noticed him. Their voices wavered, their breath heavy. The weight of his silence unsettled them. Finally, one of them snapped, "Why do you just stand there? Say something." The traveler looked at them both, and then, without a word, he walked to the side of the square and sat down beneath a tree. The crowd murmured in confusion. The arguing men exchanged glances, their anger momentarily replaced with bewilderment. Minutes passed, then more. Slowly the villagers' voices quieted. The weight of their dispute, which had seemed so urgent only moments before, now felt strange in the presence of a man who did not engage in it. One of the men clenched his jaw. "Why are you silent? We came for wisdom, not games." The traveler picked up a small bowl beside him. It was empty. He held it up for them to see. "What is in this bowl?" he asked. The crowd was silent. "Nothing," one of the men finally answered. The traveler nodded. "And if I were to fill it with water?" "It would hold the water," the other man replied. The traveler smiled faintly. "And what if I filled it with fire?" The villagers exchanged confused looks. "That would be impossible," someone muttered. The traveler turned his gaze back to the men. "Just as this bowl can only hold what is placed within it, so too can your hearts only hold what you choose to carry. If you fill them with anger, there will be no room for peace." The crowd remained still. The traveler set the bowl down gently. "You have spent your days filling your hearts with conflict, with blame, with the need to be right. But tell me, has it brought you peace?" The men looked at each other. Their anger had burned so fiercely, yet now, standing in the quiet presence of the traveler, it felt small, meaningless. "No," one of them admitted. The traveler's voice was gentle. "Then empty your bowl." A hush settled over the village square. The first man exhaled, unclenching his fists. I do not want to carry this anger anymore." The other man hesitated, then lowered his head. "Nor do I." The traveler nodded, then let it go. And just like that, the conflict that had consumed them for days dissolved in an instant. Not through force, not through argument, but through understanding. The villagers bowed in gratitude, their hearts lighter than before. As they made their way back to the monastery, the traveler felt no pride in what had happened, no sense of accomplishment. He had not sought to change them. He had only reminded them of something they had forgotten. That peace is not something that must be created. It is something that is always there, beneath the noise. That evening, as the traveler sat with the master beneath the great tree, he spoke softly. "I understand now. The world does not need more arguments. It does not need more people who speak only to be right." The master smiled. "And what does it need?" The traveler looked up at the stars. "It needs people who know how to listen." The master nodded. "Then you are beginning to see." The night deepened, and the monastery was once again wrapped in silence. But within that silence, there was something powerful, something alive. Not emptiness, not absence, but presence. A presence that did not need to be explained. It only needed to be felt. The wind carried the scent of morning rain as the traveler sat beneath the great tree, watching the sky shift from deep indigo to soft gold. The monastery had become his home, but more than that, it had become his reflection. Every stone, every gust of wind, every moment of silence had taught him something, not in words, but in presence. But the world does not allow understanding to remain untested. One morning, as the traveler walked along the monastery grounds, he noticed a young disciple sitting alone by the river. The boy's shoulders were tense, his head bowed low, his hands clenched into fists. The traveler approached and sat beside him without a word. For a long time they simply listened to the water. Finally, the boy exhaled sharply. "I do not understand," he muttered. The traveler turned to him, waiting. The boy hesitated, then spoke again. "I try to be still, to find peace like the others, but my mind refuses to be silent. I close my eyes, and instead of calm, I find a storm." The traveler reached down and picked up a small twig, tossing it into the river. The boy watched as it was carried away, disappearing around the bend. "The river does not stop flowing," the traveler said. "Even when you sit beside it in stillness, it continues." The boy frowned. "What does that have to do with my mind?" The traveler smiled. "Your mind is like the river. You cannot stop it from moving. You cannot force it to be still." The boy stared at the water, the ripples shifting endlessly. "So, I should just let my thoughts come and go?" The traveler nodded. "Yes. Observe them as you observe this river. Do not fight them. Do not follow them. Just watch." The boy fell silent, letting the lesson settle in. For the first time, he did not try to resist the thoughts in his mind. He simply let them be, and for the first time, they did not overwhelm him. The traveler stood, placing a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "Peace is not found by silencing the mind," he said. "It is found by learning to listen without being swept away." The boy looked up at him, something lighter in his expression. He did not speak, but he did not need to. The river had already answered. The days passed, and the traveler continued to move through the monastery with a quiet presence. He no longer searched for wisdom. He simply allowed it to unfold.